Afternoon all, I thought we could have a look at another Fischer memorable game from the classic 16 Memorable Games book. This is entitled A Flawed Masterpiece. Going from the back of the book is like the latest games first chronologically, but only up to about 1967. This was in Skopje 1967. Geller had a 5-3 record against Fischer, with some draws according to chessgames.com, so he had an overall plus record. He was one of the players that Fischer had bad results against. In fact, Geller, was in many world title candidates tournaments. He had an aggressive playing style. Chessgames.com have a little piece on him saying his expertise in double edge positions culminating in a positive score against no fewer than 5 world champions actually over the course of his career: Max Euwe, Mikhail Botvinnik, Vasily Smyslov, Tigran Petrosian and Fischer. He also scored victories against Spassky, Tau and Karpov, bringing his total of world champions beaten to 8, a record he shares only with Botvinnik, Petrosian and Korchnoi. He won the 1992 World Senior Chess Championship. But this Geller is an amazing player, and this game strikes me as being a very dramatic Sicilian defence game, with seemingly very simplistic goals for both sides, where both sides castle. They really went for each other's throat, and it was the person who would get there first who would win this particular game. So any resources relevant to speeding up the attack, this game shows how critical those resources can be to find. So playing white, Fischer played e4 and Geller played the Sicilian defence. After knight f3, d6, d4 opens Sicilian defence, knight f6, and now usually the most popular move in modern times is a6, a favourite of Kasparov, but here actually another move which I think is like classical Sicilian, knight c6. So not putting as much emphasis on the a6 b5 ideas, or at least not as early on. Are they in fact needed? After bishop c4, again a6 was not played, in fact e6. Okay, bishop e3, bishop e7. Now the bishop goes back to b3. So from the opening we have an aggressive piece looking down on black's position. And you might even think, well, is white even going to play f3? That's sort of an English attack with the bishop outside over there. Sometimes in the English attack system this manoeuvre is not included, bishop c4 to b3, just queen d2 castles. That's another modern treatment of playing against the Sicilian. Here black is not afraid to castle, and white plays queen e2 actually. So preparing to castle queenside with the option of still castling kingside. And now an unusual looking move, one might think, queen a5. Of course it carries with it an immediate tactical threat, but there has to be more to it than that, because white's going to castle queenside, and what will the queen be doing actively on a5? Okay, well, the point's going to be revealed. After castling queenside, black takes on d4, which also in principle looks a little bit dangerous, because after bishop takes d4 we now have 2 bishops pointing at Fischer's king potentially. And this bishop in particular, maybe it's worth a sacrifice to get this bishop covering this diagonal. Imagine the king here. It will be unpleasant with this bishop on g7. So we've got potentially 2 coordinating bishops on these diagonals. So what is it going to do here? Well, the a6 b5 plan, which occurs in many Sicilians, is again not employed here. Instead, this problem piece bishop is moved instead to be more relevant now to the centre with the move bishop d7. Okay, you could argue it's supporting b5, but actually its real purpose of bishop d7 is about to be shown. After king b1, the bishop attacks the centre actually with bishop c6. So e4 is under a bit of pressure, which might imply actually now b5, b4 is given more effectiveness to undermine e4. Is white going to play f3? Would that be a concession? Potentially, sometimes with f3 comes d5 by black. So bishop c6 also supports a potential break in the centre with d5. Fischer's not interested in f3 because he wants to use this f pawn to come here to support potentially either f5 or e5. Now f5 would emphasise actually this diagonal if e5 is ever played, as well as weakening d5. Okay, e5 might also be a useful break. So f4 is actually played. And now again we see b5 not being played, but instead, curious move, rook ad8. So the idea of this seems to be anticipating actually e5, where black could potentially take and play knight d5, with these pieces all relevant for d5. So that shows the purpose of the queen a5. It's indirectly supporting a central operation. But let's just check that out, just to be absolutely sure about this. Is e5 really answered by d takes? Knight d5, although possible actually, might not be technically the best move. Maybe knight d7 here. The rook still might have some relevance here, but so say bishop c5, black would be okay here. Okay, so let's go back. So in this position, after rook ad8, rook f1 is played. And this shows actually the rook behind the pawn. If the pawn now moves, it's obviously extending the scope of the rook, and also the rook has attacking operations possible to it to get to the black king here, rather crudely but effectively. Finally, b5 is played. Of course, without a6, black doesn't want to lose too much time in this race. He wants to try and get to the white king. So the key squares to attack on the white king position, like b2, a2 in principle, for black is g7 and h7, one would say. There's no bishops pointing at the white king though, and there's definitely two bishops pointing at the black king. So it looks as though in principle, with these two bishops complementary, that white seems to have the attacking advantage. And Fischer extends basically the scope of his light square bishop. Logically, very logically it seems, with f5. Now unless black wants to give up d5 by playing e5, that he will play b4 here, but b4 carries some risks, clearly, if white is prepared to play dynamically. It seems also that b4, doesn't it just trap the knight anyway, because where is the knight going? So Fischer's move was b4. The knight has got no squares. It can't go to a4, d1 or e2. But let's have a look, before we look at that. Say e5 had been played. This does weaken d5. It does stretch open the diagonal. Say bishop e3. White will be slightly better here, according to this computer-generated variation. So white's control of d5 is evident. Now let's go with this move, queen a4, which hits e4, bishop c1 protecting e4, rook c8 putting a bit of pressure on c2, rook f3, b4 say, which might facilitate things like rook c5 to a5, b3 queen d7. If we have this sort of position, I think white will be better. White controls d5. This bishop looks a bit passive. White's king looks pretty safe. I think white's just slightly better here. So this was a major decision to play e5 or not. Let's get an engine evaluation of this position. Slightly better, not too much, according to Houdini, about 0.2, not too much at all. So anyway, e5 wasn't played, b4 was played, so that keeps the pawn structure fluid, and it's aiming to win a piece, of course, but black is endangering his own king if white does now this stunning piece sacrifice, which is virtually forced as the knight has no squares anyway to go to. So f takes e6, so the piece is taken, piece up for 2 pawns. Black doesn't want to give up the exchange and go into that pin. That doesn't look too promising. In fact, straight away there might be something horrible like Queen H5. Let's just quickly check that out. If Rook takes F7, I don't think it's palatable. In fact, Bishop takes F7. Pardon me. King takes F7. Here, Queen C4 check. And Queen takes C6. This reminds me of a killer tactic we saw in one of the Gelfand candidates games this year. This diagonal is very dangerous often for tactics in the Sicilian. So that's not playable. There's a loose bishop on C6 here, which the engine picks up on. Just Queen C4, or picks off rather. So King H8. So now look at this position. It looks extremely dangerous. So it looks as though maybe, you know, White has played a masterpiece, you could argue. Got two very complementary bishops pointing at Black's king. This Rook, without making use of his pawns, still has got access to the Black king. There's one square here, there's another here, and another here. But it's this square, which is tempo driven, attacking the queen. With that square, potentially, Rook G5 is useful. But you could also argue Rook F4 and Rook F3 are also dangerous, coming in like this on H7. Fischer chooses Rook F5, hitting the queen. What does our engine friend think, Houdini, actually? It's giving actually Bishop takes C3 briefly. This does require a lot of analysis. And then Rook F5 maybe after that as a possibility in some lines. Actually, there's other moves that even preferred, like Queen C4 or E5. So it's not necessarily a Rook move. Okay, so let's go with Rook F5, gaining a tempo on the Black Queen. So is it accelerating Fischer's attack? Now, curiously, the Queen goes to B4. So very specific nuances of the position here. That actually the Queen is also indirectly attacking E4. So if Bishop takes C3, it does facilitate Queen takes E4 here. And White's centre dropping off is not too pleasant. That could be the end of Black's attack. Sorry, White's attack. But let's just make sure of that, if that really is the case. Appearances can be deceptive. So say Bishop takes C3, yes. Queen at E4, validated move. Say Rook F2. I think Black would stand better after D5. So Bishop C3 is being ruled out here. B takes C3. Let's quickly look at that. Queen B7. Now Queen B7 features in the game anyway. So let's go with Queen B4. So that was what was played. So it provides the possibility of attacking E4 as well as B2. As well as this nifty manoeuvre, Queen B7, which would still keep an eye on E4 and B2. So these two places are very special, B4 and B7. They're the only two squares which keep an eye on the sensitive centre and the king position at the same time. In fact, so E4 is like a vulnerability for White. So it's interesting actually now. Fischer chooses the following attacking move, Queen F1, which immediately seems to threaten Rook takes F6 and Bishop F6, just mating because of this pawn is forming part of a mating net for the Black King. Just to demonstrate that, if Knight takes E4, which was Geller's next move, it wasn't played, just Rook takes F6, fairly sure knocks Black out. So say A5 or anything else. A5, not moving the knight. Rook F6 is very strong anyway. Forcing Black to give up the queen, a ridiculous move. So this is potently very, very dangerous. So Knight takes E4, not too many moves are playable now. And here is, believe it or not, at move 20, an absolutely critical decision for Fischer. As I mentioned before, the Queen can only attack E4 and B2 from two squares, b7 or b4. b7 is a very powerful square, it seems, because by supporting e4 it means the bishop might be able to move later. If the queen's still protecting e4, then a move like queen f4 attacking the knight is not going to be so harmful for black if the queen is offering protection from b7. Now, I think Fischer criticised this next move as like the losing move, but it seems quite natural, a3, to get the queen away from the king, because it was actually supporting, for example, you know, taking and things like knight d2 maybe, or knight c3 check. The queen is striking out a few dark squares here, so it's a bit of a nuisance. So a3 unfortunately does weaken white's king as well. So the queen going back to b7 still is fulfilling these two purposes, e4 control and b2 from there. And Fischer now plays queen f4. So what is the critical difference here? Why was this a losing move? Well, let's go to the game continuation first and then get back to the position rewind. Geller played an amazing move here, facilitated by queen b7. If I give you 10 seconds, I wonder if you can spot it, or you might want to pause the video. So 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, he played bishop a4. Now note the queen b7 does facilitate this because the knight's not hanging. No queen e4, for example, which might have been key defense. So here, it's curious to see if bishop g7 is going to be a knockout blow. Fischer didn't play that. He plays the quieter queen g4, just threatening mate. As I say, both sides in this game were going for each other's throat. Black's going for b2, white's going for g7. So like in the When Champions Meet game, there's a kind of aesthetic beauty, aesthetically attractive. I dare say the word aesthetic on its own, because that might not be pedantically correct, but some argue that aesthetic does equate by default to aesthetically pleasing, or just raising the notion as aesthetics is valid in its own right, as we're talking about a chess game, not a painting. So in terms of aesthetics, this game is also extremely aesthetic, because we have two operations on either side of the board, b2 and g7 in this game, going on at the same time, where every tempo is crucial. So if every tempo is crucial and black has a defensive resource at its disposal now to defend g7, then clearly we need to investigate other resources. But first, let's see what happened in the game. Bishop f6 was used to defend g7. Of course, if takes, there's an immediate mate, so this bishop is the barrier to b2, and this bishop is the barrier to g7. So the barrier to g7 is removed with rook takes f6. And here, instead of taking on f6, a crunching move was played. I think you may be able to guess it if I give you 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, bishop takes b3. Unfortunately, for Fischer, his attack is too slow. I don't think the queen sacrifice works. He resigned here, but let's see why his attack is too slow. If queen takes g7, I think the king can safely take without getting mated. That would be a quick way to proceed things. King just crawls out, and it's perfectly okay. The crunching move after rook h6 is not bishop takes c2, but bishop a2 check, keeping the king unable to escape, because this pawn is forming part of the mating net to stop the king ever coming to d2. So if king c1, queen takes b2 will be mate. So bishop a2, running with check, b2 becomes a disaster point much quicker than g7 did. So here we have to start seeing how the race could have been won in earlier moves. So let's question first. Let's roll back just quickly here. Instead of one move, queen g4, which seems a bit slow, here was there an opportunity for bishop takes g7, you might ask? The engine likes black here in all lines, but bishop takes g7, king takes, check. It doesn't do anything, apparently. There's no queen g8. If this rook wasn't on the 7th, on the 8th, then queen g8 would actually be mating, because the bishop would be supporting queen g8. But it's not the case. It seems the white king position is caving in these variations. Another attacking move can be ignored here with bishop takes b3 in this line. And it gets hairy here, but black's better, according to the engine. So the attack can't be speeded up there. So we have to rewind further to see where it could have been speeded up. And it turns out, most annotators, including Fischer, will point out that a3 was the point where the race was lost. So in fact, there's a very deep move here, which I don't think, Houdini wasn't picking this move up for some time. Involves an entire rook sacrifice in this position. Queen f4. Now superficially the engine likes black -2 with c takes b2. So we go into c takes b2 and it's about to change its mind. It's flipped evaluation. The position is so complicated, even for a modern engine, we get an evaluation flip. C takes b2. We've got pressure on the queen here, which means a discovered check is possible to expose an attack on the queen potentially, which means knight c3 is more effectual, because bishop c3 we've got queen takes f4, especially if the queen isn't guarded. But believe it or not here, white does have a fantastic resource at his disposal. Rook h5, positively inviting knight c3 check, which would seem absolutely absurd because it's using that pin on the bishop here. If we follow this through, knight c3 check, so obviously not bishop takes c3, because queen takes f4 is just winning the queen. There's no mate or anything. But in fact, in this position, so Fischer would have had to see this if he was looking at queen f4 instead of a3. So king takes b2, sacrificing the entire rook for king c1. And in this position, if we evaluate this position, okay, material evaluation, just lost the rook. King safety evaluation, we've got one bishop pointing here, one bishop pointing there, dangerous pawn. We've got a threat of queen h6. And you might be surprised or not surprised to see that the only move it seems black has is offering up the queen with queen takes d4. Everything else loses quite horribly, apparently. So giving up the queen is the only move here. And then d5, and apparently white's only like less than the pawn up in this position. But okay. But still, small advantage for white, even in the theoretical engine sense. But if anything else, if the queen isn't being willing to be sacrificed here, so let's take in this position, arrows off, a move like d5. What is the threat? The threat really, there's multiple threats. Queen h6 is a threat, I believe. So d5, also queen f5 is a key threat, just for mating on h7. Either queen h6 or queen f5 are very strong here. Apparently queen f5 is actually stronger. And in this position, okay, black has munched the rook, but his pieces are all defensive. Look at his pieces. These three guys are not doing anything in this position. So this would have been a total masterpiece if this had been played. Look at white's pieces, especially the bishop, the rook, the queen. It's too late for the black king here. Runs out of checks. Check. Has to give up the queen in any move. He's getting mated next move. So that would have been the logical conclusion in the perfect world for Fischer. It seems the race could have been won if a3 hadn't been played, at least from an engine perspective and what we know of the game today. It seems that, from all evidence, that a3 was the losing mistake, believe it or not. Fischer's manoeuvre was correct. It was just one move too slow, this queen f4. It introduces a whole host of threats, like queen h6, like rook h5 and queen f5. But in some positions you do need ultra precision to see all the amazing resources available, even if it's sacrificing a rook. So here, the move queen f4 looks to be absolutely ludicrous in conjunction with rook h5, leaving the queen kind of tactically loose to knight c3, which would appear to be winning an entire rook. But apparently white's attack crashes through in this position, believe it or not. If you think there's a defence here, please do post it on YouTube. This looks to be completely lost. If, you know, bishop f6, this rules some out as well. It's just queen takes f6, quite dramatic. Just emphasising that, you know, the bishop coming to f6 will be mate because of that pawn as well, you know. So black's king is really in a very difficult position. So time is absolutely of the essence in this game. There's that expression, time is of the essence. And we have here diagrammatic, like aesthetic attacks on both sides, g7 and b2. So quite amazing that okay, Geller, was he a bit lucky to get away with this? One inaccuracy here, a3, seems to give him an extra boost, basically making bishop a4 available, supporting knight on e4. It wouldn't have been available in the other variation. So say queen f4 here, bishop a4 here is harmless. Queen takes e4, and there's nothing going on for black. So there's all the difference. The queen being on b7 or b4 makes a lot of difference there. Okay, so let's go back in overview and summary of this game. So we have here a time is of the essence masterpiece spoiled by not willing to give up a rook in that line, or if he had seen that line thinking it was too dangerous, thinking a3 was a luxury that was available. But it seems a3 pushed the queen into a strategically an attacking point, a useful square at the same time. It's also curious black's lack of a6 and b5. The piece play is emphasised more, and control of the centre. In fact, you could argue, you know, bishop d6 to c6, e4 all the time, and in fact even rook d8 is basically central as well. So the Russians knew the importance of the centre as a basis for counterattack and defence. But it looks as though white's pieces are all optimally placed for this attack on the king as well. And indeed, you know, potentially, after offering this knight sack, they indeed were, but it required the absolute precision to follow this up correctly. Rook f5, you know, you can't really criticise rook f5 if it gains a tempo on the queen and further accelerates white's attack. The queen going to b4 doesn't seem that significant. I mean, there weren't too many places it could have gone to. So Queen F1 here creates an immediate threat, practically forcing either a knight d7 or knight e4. Of course, knight e4 is nice to gobble white's central pawn. And here the crucial blunder, it seems, a3. Amazing that now it's really quite difficult for white. Just that key difference of supporting the central outpost e4 is making all the difference. b2 and e4. It's a game of divine simplicity as well as race conditions, optimal race conditions where time is of the essence. Divine simplicity I find because it's just two key squares which are continually the focus of the tactical war here. So bishop a4 trying to get to b2, queen g4 lining up for g7, and then the crucial time gain move, bishop f6. Absolutely crucial time gaining move for gaining time for the attack on b2, putting something in the way. So after rook takes f6 to try and blast through again to b2, where bishop takes b3, and here it's all over. Fischer had to resign. A flawed masterpiece indeed, one which requires purposely giving up a rook, it seems, putting the queen on a loose square unprotected, allowing a seemingly dangerous and cunning knight c3 check to win a rook on d1. But if that's what it took to accelerate white's attack on g7, then that's what it took. A flawed masterpiece. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much. Okay, here is a video addendum. Time to test you guys on the game which you've just seen, your understanding of the game, all the little finesses. If you log into chessworld.net for the next week, you'll have access to Play Like Geller. This will be your welcome page. There's a link, Play Like Geller, which if you click this, you'll get to play like Geller how we've seen. So trying to guess Geller's next moves. So c5 was the first move. And for every wrong move, it will rewind your move, and after 3 incorrect tries, I know this is ridiculous, just to show you, it will give you the option to show the next move. So you can play like Geller here and practice what you've picked up in this game. It was quite a short game, so I think good for this experimental addition to this video. So this is an interactive test. If you log into chessworld.net, it's in either your welcome page, or if you do have a game going on, it will be on the right. If we go into a game, community games, any game, or if you did suggest a welcomer, you get a game. But let's just show you on the games page. So we'll go to games. Go into any game at the moment. There's second every move a second, but on your messages tab there'll be Play Like Geller as well, so you can go into this test. So it's on your message tab if you do have a game, Play Like Geller. So even if you don't have a current game, on your welcome page, which you can get access to from here anyway, so go back to your welcome page, it's on Picks of the Day. So please try out the test, Play Like Geller, to test your understanding of all the little finesses of that game. Thanks very much.